Round about the cauldron go, in the poison's entrails throw. Toad that under cold stone, days and nights has 31. Sweated venom, sleeping got, boil thou first in the charmed pot. Double, double, toil and trouble, fire burn and cauldron bubble. Disney witches, a classic mainstay, but have they fared well? That's yet to say. I love witches. I love all kinds of witches, and even twitches, too. Magic and the occult have always intrigued me, and there isn't a day that goes by that I don't wish I was able to clean up my room with a flick of a wand the same way that Alex Russo does in the Wizards of Waverly Place opening. I even dressed up as a witch. For this video, does that count towards my coven application, or is that appropriation? BT dubs, if there's any covens that have openings, call me. But what I love almost as much as witches is seeing witches in the media. From vindictive villainesses to seductive femmes, witches have always managed to steal every scene they're in because of how interesting they are as a concept. So, to close out the Halloween season, I want to talk about witches, but not just any kind of witches. Disney witches. But before we get into all of that, my name is Cher, and this is my art and commentary space where I like to talk about media that interests me. If you're new here, hello! Feel free to check out my previous videos and see if this channel is something that you're interested in. And if you're returning, hello! Welcome back. Always a pleasure to see you again. I hope you all enjoy this fairly brief analysis into the complicated and evolving relationship between Disney and witches. By the pricking of my thumbs, something wicked this way comes. The many characterizations of the witch in the history of Western media often symbolizes Western society's changing relationship to female empowerment. In eras of stringent oppression and repression of femininity, the witch symbolized the societal fears of wanton women, and they're often harbingers of a patriarchal unraveling that, if not kept in check, had to be stamped out entirely. And it's in this era that the Disney company, its ethics and morals, was conceived. Disney. Society's greatest beacon of wholesome, family-friendly entertainment. When they aren't dabbling in stereotypes that don't age well, of course. Though always intending to be non-offensive media with predominantly Christian values and morals that the whole family can enjoy, even the mouse can't refrain from indulging in the genre of magic or the occult, not only because their success is built upon fantasy-driven narratives, but because magic is cool and flashy and a great way to get butts in seats when you promise to build upon the spectacle of previous films. It's natural then that witches, a classic staple of the fantasy genre, would have to make their grand appearances. And it's in Disney's first theatrical film in color, 1937's Snow White, that we're introduced to the evil queen. A witch who sets the tone, the aesthetic, the precedent for the many witches that follow in the Disney canon. And what an entrance she makes. I mean, even just breaking it down aesthetically, like character design-wise. Like, at first glance, the queen harshly clashes with our protagonist, Snow White. The queen's deep voice, painted face, and dark colors give an air of maturity, self-confidence, and a sensual allure. These features are completely at odds with that of the gentler, softer, and more naturalistic Snow White. More than just contrasting, though, the queen's feminine appearance, though beautiful in its own right, gives the impression of being highly constructed and artificial. Her femininity is not innate, but more like a costume or performance, something that can be put on and taken away at will. And this is more clearly demonstrated with the queen's ability to transform and shapeshift from traditional femininity and womanhood to the hag. But even when back in her normal appearance, her performance of womanhood is, again, well, just that, a performance that's highly theatrical and more in line with a really good, drag queen than that of the subdued feminine in Snow White. And this drag-like performance is something that ingratiates her into queer readings of her character, and also why she remains a fan favorite in queer spaces. But instead of the narrative leaning into that performance and critiquing the constructs of beauty or womanhood, it falls into the comfort of denouncing her as odd or queer. And in this era, that which is queer or deviates from the heteronormative script is to be frightened and defeated. And so she is. In Sleeping Beauty, we see the return of the deceptively beautiful witch in the figure of Maleficent. And yes, I will talk about the live-action movies, but that's later on. Maleficent is, without contest, the most powerful witch in the movie. Her curse on Aurora is so strong that it can only be amended, not entirely removed. Yet even with this grand power, she is characterized and defeated in much the same way as the evil queen. A powerful woman that sets out to prove her superiority, so she shapeshifts or sheds her womanhood to do so, and is ultimately defeated so that the princess may live out her predetermined happily ever after. And it's worth noting again here that the shapeshifting here strips Mal completely of her perceived femininity when she transforms into a dragon. And this here makes an interesting point as to how Disney viewed feminine anger and wickedness in their early films. As Elizabeth Bell notes in From Mouse to Mermaid, The Politics of Film, Gender, and Culture, female wickedness is rendered as middle-aged beauty at its peak sexuality and authority. calling attention specifically to the age and sexual agency of all the evil witches. They are invariably too old to be virtuous brides, but too young to be nurturing grandmothers. Their excess sexual energy is not aiding in reproduction, nor have they been rendered completely sexless by the aging process, marking them as transgressive beings to be feared. And it's clear that in these narratives that their independence is one part of their transgression. Both Maleficent and the Queen are bold and unflinching in their sexuality while maintaining their bodily autonomy and personal power. Moving from there to the iconic sea witch, Ursula, in 1989's The Little Mermaid, Ursula embodies many of the previous themes, even down to the purple and black color scheme. Her bodily autonomy and sexual allure are more fully on display, though, as she's much less covered up than the previous witches, and is also much less shy about showing off her many curves. What we also see in Ursula is the shift from the subdued, queer-coded witch to full-out camp. Now, camp is a lot of things, but for a more concise definition, we can look to Susan Sontag's Notes on Camp and definition of camp as a sensibility that revels in artifice, stylization, and exaggeration rather than content. And the aesthetics of camp were predominantly embraced in queer communities, and as acceptance for queer people started to shift in the late 80s to the early 90s, these camp aesthetics made their way into mainstream media. It's why a character like the divine-inspired Ursula was able to even exist. The flamboyance and camp nature of Disney's witches in this era could now be humorous and enjoyable, but it was still not seen as the ideal to be followed, and therefore camp characters, unless they acted fully under the service of these straight heroes, couldn't fully be trusted. And though Ursula's flamboyance was fun, her ultimate threat to Ariel's potential marriage meant that she was disrupting the social order and had to be stopped. And this leads into what can be considered a Disney witch's biggest transgression, their threat to the social order. The witches of this era were portrayed as threatening because they used their allure and power to lead the innocent young heroines astray. And these actions that marked such witches as wanton women, or even worse, lesbian. That is to say that these older and mature women who led young unmarried girls off the straight and narrow fed directly into many fears and stereotypes about lesbians at the time. But it must be said that even in these early depictions of witches, there was still the dichotomy of the good witch and the bad witch. Witches who were still powerful in their own right, but used their powers correctly, could still be socially acceptable witches. Take, for instance, Aurora's fairy godmothers. Though the godmothers bumble at human tasks and frequently argue amongst themselves, because their use of magic is more selfless and, more importantly, for the good of a child, they are humanized in the film. Because to be a good Disney witch, especially in this era, you must be selfless, you must be nurturing, and you must sacrifice. This dichotomy also feeds into ideas of women that persist today and how if they aren't busy being nurturers or caregivers, that they are either scheming and tricking to get back at a patriarchal system, much like Maleficent and, to a greater extent, Ursula. Though witches have often been characterized as wicked women, the rise of feminism from the 1920 suffragettes to third and fourth wave feminism has pushed ideals of female empowerment beyond a method of fear tactics. How do you tame a witch? Historically, you don't. You kill her, burn her, hang her. In tales, the witch is often a her, a she-devil, if you will. A woman who sleeps with Lucifer, who is Satan's mistress, who bears a demonic mark. Read the 15th century witch hunters Malleus Maleficarum. It'll tell you. Her existence, her body itself, is a portal from one world to others, and she must be put down, lest she tears a rip in reality itself. This quote is from Gianna Cadlick's article, Deconstructing Disney, Motherhood, and the Taming of Maleficent, wherein she discusses Disney's attempt to redeem Maleficent and reconcile a story that puts her as a villain by offering a different perspective to the story. And I personally think that, in much the same way that Disney's tried to reconcile older narratives in their modern live-action attempts, the movie, in this regard, comes off as kinda meh in that endeavor. I think it's good that we've come to a point where we can see women anti-heroes as deserving of some sympathy, but I don't know if making Maleficent a mother was necessarily the right way to go about it. That said, the test of motherhood for the witch has been offered before in Disney canon with both the Evil Queen and Mother Gothel, because as established before, good witches can exist so long as they play the role of caregivers. The Queen and Gothel's inability to put their child before themselves denies them the ability to be good witches and therefore necessitates their undoing. They refuse to sacrifice for their children in much the same way that mothers are expected to, so the narrative sacrifices them for us. And much like the standards of motherhood today, they aren't offered much grace for error in their parenting in the same way as, say, King Triton or the Sultan. And yes, sure, I'm not going to ignore that they've done some pretty abhorrent things in those films, but I think it's also pretty interesting that their failure to be mothers and parents is also part of that. In Maleficent 2, Maleficent passes this test of selflessness by committing the most extreme form of sacrifice, dying to protect her child. The film rewards her by allowing her to rise from the dead like a phoenix and continue to protect Aurora in a cool, edgy, goth mom sort of way. Though, Even with this critique, I still do like the positive portrayal of the non-biological found family in Maleficent films, though it kind of still feels like a way to tether Maleficent's powers to a child or some sort of offspring. With that said, I think this is also a move to capitalize on the changing perspective of witches, and so I think we should move on to the way that witches have been reclaimed, both in society as well as within the Disney canon itself. You've always had power, my dear. You just had to learn it for yourself. As queer acceptance and feminism is slowly ingratiating itself into mainstream society, the witch becomes something not to be feared, but to be embraced. Being a witch is cool and trendy now, and hell, even fun for the whole family. And that marked a noticeable shift in the 90s to 2000s in Disney media that introduced a new generation of teen witches, from Marnie and Halloween Town to Twitches to Wizards of Waverly Place, even though that last one's kind of averse to calling Alex a witch, even though she totally is one. Teen witches symbolize a sort of magical puberty and cautioned about responsibility that having any kind of power wielded. In more recent years, the roles of witches in Disney canon has been reclaimed. And I think Elsa first marked this sort of reclamation. A witch in all but name, though I guess technically an elemental by the second film, though she's totally a witch. And actually, I've kind of noticed in some Disney media, like Wizards of Waverly Place, as mentioned before, they're kind of averse to calling their female characters witches. I feel like there's been like this sort of back and forth on that. I don't know, it's just something that I've noticed. But back to Elsa. Even though she bears the hallmarks of previous magical villainesses with dark colors in the beginning of the film, and also her ability to transform, her transformation sequence is more in line with that of the classic Disney dress transformation than an act of deceit or malice. And I think depictions of witches in the Owl House have been the most radical of Disney witches to date, with the show embracing the queer aspects of witches as representation rather than something to be feared. The whole show is filled with queer-tinged concepts like the found family trope, and actual queer characters like Luce, Amity, Rain, and maybe Ida? And speaking of Ida, I really enjoy her character because she's this middle-aged witch badass who, yes, eventually does take in some of the younger characters and assumes a parental role, but that isn't something that's innate to her. She has to learn, and she screws up, and she's given the kind of grace other male cartoon characters and male characters in general are allowed to have. She's also very open about her romantic experiences and sexual agency without being shamed for it in the narrative at all. And these are all reasons why I'm so sad to see the show go, but I am also happy that we've evolved to a point in society where a show like this could be made. And this current era of modern witches is one that I've been predominantly growing up in, and why I kind of feel such a kindred spirit with them. They're unrestrained women, and sometimes non-women, who are beholden to no oppressive society, a patriarchal system, actively rebelling against these rules. And these more modern witches are more relatable than they've ever been in Disney canon because they're allowed to make mistakes, but they're still offered redemption in the narrative, and they can kind of become a thing to be more relatable and kind of to look up to. So with that said, I think we'll end our video here. I hope you all enjoyed this video. I originally wanted to talk about the history of and prominence of witches in all of Western media, but I decided that that video would be a lot longer than I had time to edit and cover. But if you're still interested in me covering it, leave a comment down below and I'll see what I can magic up. Now I want to know, who's your favorite Disney witch in the proper Disney canon? I think for me right now, I'm on such a Owl House kick that I feel like Ida is definitely one of my favorite top 3, top 2 witches that I've seen and that I relate to a lot. So let me know again down in the comments what witches or what witchy things from Disney media that you enjoy. So with all that said, I'm gonna leave you here. Goodbye and have a very happy and spooky Halloween. Bye.